Tonight on Nation to Nation, the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is almost over. But will it get results?
This is a national crisis that requires a crisis-like response.
The inquiry faced a lot of criticism over the last 2 years. Some bluntly stated that the Chief Commissioner should step down.
I think that she needed to hear the voice of the people that were feeling the same way I was.
Buller says she was never going to walk away. Criticism, in fact, made her stronger.
The more the criticism, the more the personal attacks on me, the more strength I got to move forward.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamirande, and welcome to Nation to Nation. The end is almost here for the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The last public submissions are being held this week in Ottawa.
There were times that I felt like I couldn't go on. And there were personal sacrifices, such as an internal commitment to participate in one of our big lodges for the first time. When I spoke with one of our spiritual people, he explained to me this process was my big lodge. I sacrificed and persevered and fell down and didn't think I could get up. And only by the grace of Creator and ceremony was I able to stand and continue.
Soon, the inquiry will submit its final report to the federal government. Over the last couple of years, commissioners have heard from hundreds of people, families who have lost loved ones to murder, or they have simply vanished, and how police have ignored their pleas for help or mishandled cases. At times, it's been a bumpy road for the inquiry that hasn't had a shortage of critics. Here to discuss all that is Chief Commissioner Marion Buller. Commissioner Buller, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
We're at the finish line or close to it, so what's it like for you as we're this close?
Well, first of all, it's kind of hard to believe because we've been working very hard over the last couple of years, and it's just hard to believe we're coming to the end, literally. But it's been great. We've heard from families and survivors all across Canada. We've heard from over 100 experts and knowledge keepers across Canada about a variety of subjects. We've had, I think, over 600 submissions for artistic expression. And now this week and 2 weeks ago in Calgary, we're hearing closing submissions from parties with standing. So it's been great work, fabulous work, and we've learned a lot.
As you were telling me off camera, you're though getting ready to roll up your sleeves because you still have a bit of work to do. What happens after you finally do write your draft report and submit it to the federal government?
Well, then it's going to be time to wind down the offices, close everything up. We have a lot of documents and other records that have to go to Library and Archives Canada. We have staff, of course, we have to say goodbye to, and some very dear friends we have to say goodbye to. So at the end of June, all the lights in all of the offices will be turned off. All the documents and other items will be at Library and Archives Canada.
Of course, it has not always been easy. We certainly have reported on some of the troubles the inquiry has here at APTN News. And some have even called for you to step down and attacked you personally. Did you ever feel like walking away at any point?
Never. And in fact, the more the criticism, the more the personal attacks on me, the more strength I got to move forward. We're always open to criticism, to listen to criticism, good, informed, constructive criticism, and we've made really good changes in the way we do our work as a result. But no, in fact, the personal attacks in particular really motivated me to continue in a very strong way.
Despite that criticism, what are some of the things you could point to and say were positives out of this whole experience?
Oh, gee, where to start? How much time do you have, Todd? We've seen individual changes in people as they've given their testimony. Families and survivors who will start off terrified and very, very upset, understandably so. And by the time they finish their statement with us, which could be 1 hour, 8 hours for that matter, whatever time they needed they got, you could see an absolute transformation in them physically even, much lighter looking, maybe a little bit of laughter by the end of it. We've heard back, I've personally heard back from individuals who, as a result of giving testimony before us, have gone back to school, they've gone for counseling, they've reported abusers to the police. So there have been a lot of individual changes. And then with our healing plans after the fact for family members and survivors, we've had great feedback from many people about how they've been able to move on through maybe culturally specific healing, through reconciling with family members, that sort of thing, moved on to a whole new, very healthy space. So there's been an incredible amount of good change individually and also, I can see, collectively across Canada as well.
Of course, there are a tremendous amount of expectations put on the inquiry even before it got started. I suppose what's going to be the biggest disappointment for people, I think, based on the expectations that were there before?
We're trying to avoid the biggest, what some people say will be the biggest disappointment. I think the biggest letdown that we have heard about is that this report will sit on a shelf and gather dust. And so we intend, by how we word our recommendations to the government, that they're actionable, immediate, concrete recommendations so that this doesn't sit on the shelf. Plus, I have to say, going across Canada and speaking to families and survivors and listening to them, more importantly, they're determined, after sharing their truths with us, that they're not going to let this sit on the shelf either.
I suppose who's the biggest villain in all this? Of course, the perpetrators of the crimes are the villains, but is it the police who didn't perhaps work harder on these cases, or is it the indifference of the Canadian public in general? I suppose, is there something you can point at that really needs to change?
I think the one thing that has to change is attitude, that this is a national crisis that requires a crisis-like response, an immediate response and a comprehensive response. I can't say that there's one villain. That would be easy. Our work would have been done months ago if that was the case, but it's a bigger issue than that.
Of course, the main criticism is, and I can understand it, that there may not be an answer for people who've lost somebody they've loved, or maybe there won't be a change in the local police department who looks into these cases. How do you make that change, though, I guess, as a society?
I think the first step in making that change is education. And through our public hearings, when we've heard from families and survivors, from experts and knowledge keepers as well, there's been a tremendous public education component to what we're doing. And I think the Canadian public now has a better idea of the magnitude of this crisis across Canada. And that's a beginning, because then people understand the need for change.
When you talk about education and change, where does the change start? Is it here in Ottawa with the politicians up on the Parliament Hill? Or do we have to think about it even earlier in elementary schools?
Can I say all of the above and everything in between? We have to start with education as soon as children are able to read and write, going all the way to Parliament Hill and every stop in between. But I think what we have to do is start with ourselves as well, as one avenue. And it used to be in the government policies, they would say we have to take the Indian out of the child, or we have to kill the Indian in the child and reform them. I think now what we have to do as Indigenous peoples across Canada is, with great delight and pride, put the Indian back in the child, put the Métis back in the Métis child, and put the Inuit back in the Inuit child, and let them know that they're loved and treasured and valuable individuals.
Finally, as the inquiry winds down, as you say, we're in our final submissions here in Ottawa, do you have any regrets, or is there any one thing you'd want to change if you could go back in time?
You know, time. Time has always been our biggest challenge. I wish that the government had given us the 2 years that we asked for, because then we could have gone into more depth and more breadth in our investigation of the issues that are affecting Indigenous women and girls in such a deleterious way for generations. That's my big regret, is the lack of time that we were given.
And the time, would there have been anything in particular you could have examined more closely?
Oh, many different things. But for example, we wanted to be able to reach out to women in prisons across Canada. There are far too many Indigenous women and girls incarcerated across Canada. Now we're very limited in being able to do that. We also wanted to be able to do more research into the issues faced by members of the 2S community, as well as youth and now elders, elder abuse, violence that elders are facing. So we've really been limited in the scope of the work that we can do, which will limit our recommendations.
Does that in any way take away from how effective this report will be then?
I know it sounds like a contradiction, but we're still going to make, from my perspective, very meaningful, concrete recommendations for change. There won't be as many, perhaps. Our critics will probably find gaps in the recommendations we make, and that I'm going to say right now is due to the lack of time.
Well, speaking of time, we're out of it, and I want to thank you for talking to me today. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's always a delight. Thank you.
We'll have more after another short break. Welcome back. As we just heard, the inquiry's final report will be limited. That's because the Trudeau government declined a 2-year extension, instead settling for a 6-month one. Critics of the inquiry have had a lot to say over the last 2 years, from its lack of power to force police to reopen investigations, to dozens of staff resigning, even a commissioner, and several even wanting the inquiry shut down, or at least restarted. One of the most vocal critics has been our next guest, Sheila North, who at one time pointedly asked Chief Commissioner Marion Buller to step down at an AFN assembly a year ago. She joins us now from our APTN Winnipeg studio. Welcome to Nation to Nation, Ms. North.
Thank you, Todd.
You are one of the most prominent critics of the inquiry. Why has that been?
Because I saw how hard the women and advocates and families and survivors of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls worked to get to this point of awareness and respect. I saw them marching on the street so passionately. Sometimes there was 3 people, sometimes there was 3,000, and I know this issue is very near and dear to their hearts and still is. So I think for them, I was always wanting the best for them and to honor the work that they did to get to this level of awareness of the issue.
Where do you think the inquiry got wrong? Was it right at the beginning, or was it sometime along the way?
I think right from the beginning, what I was hoping, and I think a lot of people were hoping, was that the people that brought this issue to the national and now the international level should have been the ones talking about the process and how it should have been carried out and what should have been the focus, including policing and child welfare. And so those things didn't seem to be on the radar when the process started, and there was some missteps that made it feel like it was a court process. It actually felt like that the women and survivors and families were on trial rather than the issue and tragedy being on trial. So right from the beginning, it didn't seem like it was, respecting the women that were hurting the most and the families that were hurting the most, not just women, but families of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so I think right from the beginning, the processes should have been incorporating what the needs of the community were, and they simply weren't. And I think that set the tone. I was hoping, and I think a lot of people were giving the benefit of the doubt when it started, but it was just increasingly getting more disappointing and more concerning because we knew that it was just a short amount of time that this was going to be happening.
Was there any 1 or 2 things you would have done differently, I suppose, if you'd been Chief Commissioner?
I think if I had seen a bunch of staff leaving, I would have been very concerned myself as a Chief Commissioner, and thinking that that the tone and the way that the process is, or any organization is led, the tone is set by the leader, and if people are jumping ship and not having faith in the process, then that should say a lot to someone leading an organization or a process. And so there was cause for concern there, and that's why a lot of us spoke up to say that something has to change, something needs to be adjusted, and even the way that the setups of some of the hearings were, it felt like a courtroom, so that had to be changed. And so a lot of us that were critics of it were doing it, I believe, out of concern and love for the people that were hurting the most. And so, you know, if it wasn't for that, then, you know, it would have just been a normal process. But I think we did help keep the commissioners and this process accountable. And no matter how hard it was, and no matter how hard it was to speak out and to hear some of the criticisms, I think it was very necessary, because this is such a critical issue that has to be dealt with in the right way, you know, led by the people that are impacted by it the most.
As I mentioned in the introduction, Ms. North, you of course quite publicly and face-to-face asked the Chief Commissioner to step down at the AFN Assembly just over a year ago. Do you have any regrets now about the way that happened?
Oh, no, I don't. I think that she needed to hear the voice of the people that were feeling the same way I was. It wasn't just me feeling that way. And for her to go on public TV and mainstream media to say that she wasn't going to adhere to the chief's resolution calling for her resignation, I thought that was very disrespectful. And that was one of the points that I think that really, you know, triggered a lot of us, just a lack of disrespect by the leadership themselves, not only just the survivors and families of missing and murdered women, but then in turn to say that she wasn't going to adhere to a resolution or a chief's wishes across the country to have her step aside. And I even went to, you know, make a compromise and personally talk to her and her other commissioners later on to say, why don't we just reach a middle ground and say that you all co-lead, and that, you know, that all of your perspectives be equally measured here and used rather than just one, because I think that it was flawed to begin that way, to have one chief lead commissioner. I know we always need someone to lead, but we also need to be mindful and be flexible to say that I don't know everything and I have to bring other people in. And she may think that they have done that, and I hope that they have, but we'll see in the final reports how that turned out.
Speaking of the final report, of course, it's expected at the end of April. It will be limited because they never did get a 2-year extension and more money like they wanted to. Do you feel that that will affect how the report is viewed at this point?
I have some concerns about what the report is going to find. It didn't seem like that they were going to touch the child welfare aspect of it, other than looking at past reports or even the policing. And if it wasn't for advocates and families that push to have those things, and our lawyers, when I was Grand Chief at MKO, I had our lawyers make sure that we pushed for the inclusion of the subject on child welfare and incarceration rates and all of those things. And so I think it was kind of mind-boggling to know that we had to push to get that. And now we know that it's in some of the final submissions, so that'll be good. But at the same time, I don't know what the report is going to find, especially given the attitude towards you know, Indigenous leadership. I'm concerned that the report will say that they're doing this to themselves, which is what some of you know, Canadians would like to believe, but this is a Canadian problem with many people, you know, at fault and many factors at play. And so I think we all have to look at it as a nation to understand that this is a national tragedy that affects all of us, the most vulnerable people in this country, and that's Indigenous women and girls. We're discriminated at many levels in this country, and this is part of it. And that if anything good thing comes out of this inquiry is to make Canada and the international community aware that we will not stand for it. We are resilient people. We are resilient women and girls. And you know, as ugly and flawed as the process was, we made the point. Our women and girls and advocates and families and survivors made the point, stood their ground, and said this is not wrong. And I think that'll continue, in spite of, you know, how this happened and even beyond the report findings.
Do you think we've turned a tide on this issue? Of course, this was an issue under the Harper government. It continued under the Trudeau government. Will this report help turn a tide so that we're not talking about this again 10 years from now?
I certainly hope so, and I think a lot of people are. There is some things that have changed out of it. More people are aware of it. You can probably go into any grocery line now and start talking to people about the issue, and they'll have some knowledge of it, whether it's, you know, it's for one or the other or whatever the opinion is. At least people are more aware of it now. And I also see a lot of great hope in the international community and the world, because I've been to the UN twice talking about these issues, and women from across the world have come to us and are actually looking at Canadian Indigenous women and girls as the leads for this subject. And in the States, I'm getting more and more requests to come and talk about the issue as they're trying to catch up to what the problem is there. And very similar situations here that we faced in Canada, of course, are similar to the States, and they're just starting to get that work going. And thanks to the work that was done in Canada, they have a lot to work from. And so on that front, I believe that there is a lot more respect for Indigenous women and girls, but at the same time, we don't match the level of opportunities that they deserve in terms of education and economic stability and all of those things. I think we still have a long way to go to afford Indigenous women and girls the equal footing that they need to be who they want to be and who they need to be for their families. And so, you know, I think we're on a long journey yet together, but we've come a long way, and thanks to the women and girls and families and survivors who made it happen.
Well, I will no doubt be asking your opinion on the report when it comes out at the end of April. Ms. North, thank you for talking to me now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Todd.
We'll have more after another short break. Welcome back. Well, that's our show tonight. But for next week, we'll have the leader of the federal NDP, Jagmeet Singh. He dropped by our Ottawa studio. Part of his interview is how he sees the UN Declaration on Indigenous People working once Bill C-262 is passed.
Any agreement with Sweden would recognize that Sweden is a sovereign nation and that any partnership would have to be informed, it would have to be done prior, and it would have to be free. And in fact, it should also go beyond that. It should be something that's mutually beneficial.
As well, we speak to Liberal MP for Winnipeg Centre, Robert Falcon-Ouellette. He hammers home the scale of the crystal meth crisis, even in his constituency office, and the need to do something.
Yeah, people have come in, they've assaulted staff, they come in, they sit down, and they sit down and they literally, when they're on the drug, they'll start propositioning you, trying to sell you stolen goods, you know, and the issue for me is when I would call or you know, try and get someone off the streets, someone who's working in the sex trade, trying to pay for their addiction, and they're wanting to get off the streets, I could never actually locate services on a Friday afternoon or a Wednesday afternoon.
They'll both be on next week's show. And if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamirande. Thanks for watching.